So, Paul's saying in Romans chapter 2, therefore, verse 1, he says, and when you see the word therefore, look at who it's there for. Now, if you look at the previous chapter, which is Romans chapter 1, which is one of the chapters that speaks emphatically to the homosexual lifestyle, to men who lay with men, women who lay with women, all those things, it speaks emphatically to all that. And then it's interesting that Paul follows up to begin talking about judging others harshly or outside of the confines of the Word of God, because what Paul's talking about in chapter 1 lines up with the Word of God. But he says, therefore, in light of all I just said, in light of everything I just told you, you have no excuse. You don't have a defense. You have no justification, he says. Whoever you are who judges and condemns another. He's saying because if you are posing as judge and you're passing sentence on another, you actually condemn yourself. He's really hinging off a lot of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7. He says, you are guilty of practicing the very same things that you are denouncing and that you censure. But he says in verse 2, but we are sure, in other words, we know, we're positive, we're sure, we know that the judgment, the adverse verdict, the sentence of God falls justly and in accordance with truth upon those who practice these things. In other words, God's judgment is true, God's judgment is righteous, God's judgment is on the money. God's judgment is right on the mark. It falls justly. But then verse 3 says, and do you think or imagine, oh man, when you judge and you condemn those who practice these things, and yet you do them yourself? There's the kicker. That's the point. You think or you imagine, oh man, when you judge and condemn those who practice these things, and yet you do them yourself, you think you're going to escape God's judgment? When you're guilty of doing the very same thing that you're condemning them over? You think you're going to escape the judgment of God because of who you are? Because of what you're called to do or to be? You think that's going to be listen, how many pastors have gotten in pulpits and preached on adultery and they were doing it themselves? Do they think because they're the pastor, it's okay for them to commit those things they condemn others for? Do they think that they've got a free pass? Do they think they're going to escape God's judgment as well? No. That's what Paul's saying here. You're condemning others who are doing the very same thing that you're committing, that you're practicing, that you're living in, and you think you're going to get away from God's judgment too? Ain't going to happen. That's Parnell's translation. Ain't going to happen. When you judge and condemn those who practice these things, and you do them yourself, he says, you're not going to escape God's judgment. You're not going to elude his sentence and his adverse verdict. You're not going to get away from that. And so we need prayer and we need love if we're to perform successful eye surgery. In other words, we got to first get our board out of our face. We got to first get the beam out of our eye. He said, because then, he says, back over in Matthew again, chapter 7, verse 4, he says, because then, when you do that, then you can see clearly. Then you can see how to help your brother get his eye straightened out. How you can get that speck of dust out of his eye. And so we've got to treat them the way we want them to treat us. We've got to respond to them the way we want them to respond to us. And the New Testament scriptures are filled with exhortations to mark those who cause divisions among you. Well, that's a discernment. That's a judgment. But we're called to do that. The same ones that, when you mark those who cause division among you, that's the very ones who pop up and say, you can't judge me. But we're called to do that. It tells us to receive not those who deny Christ. Don't receive them. If they're going to deny the Son of God, you don't receive them. They deny that Jesus is the Son of God and that Jesus is indeed God. Don't receive them into your fellowship. Now, we think that sounds harsh. We think, well, everybody ought to be able to come to church. Well, they should have access to church, but they can't come here peddling some sort of junk. They can't come here peddling some sort of false doctrine or some sort of heresy, such as that. We're called to do that. We're called to observe that. We're called to exhort. I mentioned a while ago, we're called to rebuke. And listen, rebuke is not very pleasant. We're called to excommunicate people if need be. How many times you heard of church excommunicating people in our day and time? Very rarely. Very rarely. First of all, they just don't have the brass to do it. That's the bottom line. They don't have the brass to do what Jesus himself exhorted us to do. Now, we've had to do it here. It's not a pleasant thing. It's not pleasant at all, but it was a necessary thing. Sometimes it is necessary and of necessity. And listen, I'm not saying that at the drop of a hat to kick everybody out. I'm saying, please don't think I'm saying that. I'm saying in extreme circumstances, sometimes that's the only alternative, is to give them the left foot of fellowship. And so certainly judging ourselves and those who have failed in their spiritual responsibility is a necessity of church discipline. There is such a thing as church discipline. You can look at what Paul, I'm not going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 because for sake of time we can't read all that and get into that today anyway. But write it down, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and go see what Paul, how he dealt with some church problems. And I'm sure a lot of them in the church of Corinth want to tell Paul, well, Paul, you got no right to come in here and judge us. And Paul had every right. He was, first of all, the apostle. And he had every right to set things straight and set matters straight. So the point being made here is that we are not to judge the inner motives of another. We're not to render a verdict based upon prejudiced information. And I hope I've made that point clear by now, okay? Because I want to bring the other side. Now here's the rest of the story. I put on Facebook, Matthew 7:1, judge not lest you be judged. And under that I put, and now the rest of the story. As Paul Harvey used to say, now we get into the rest of the story. And I'm going to find a landing strip to circle here in just a moment. But look at verse 5. And Jesus rightfully says, you hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of your own eye, and you shall see clearly to cast out the mote out of your brother's eye. You hypocrite. Hypocrite's a harsh word. And too many, I've said before, we use that word too lightly sometimes. We use that word too sparingly sometimes. No, not sparingly, but overuse it sometimes. We use it out of context a lot of times. The word hypocrite is a very serious word. It's a very serious accusation. Be careful when you call someone a hypocrite, because there's a lot of weight and connotation to that word. And just because someone stumbles, someone messes up from time to time, that doesn't automatically make them a hypocrite. I want to make that clear. Be careful in your use of that word, because when Jesus used that word, it was serious business. He didn't just lightly use